Hey, thank you for joining. We're going to get started in just a couple of seconds while I let some more folks in from the waiting room.
Yeah, you're fine.
Thank you for being here today. I'm just going to go ahead and mute everybody upon joining, just because we do have a little bit of a larger group today and I don't want any background noises. So thank you for coming today. I'm just going to get started now because we do have a pretty tight agenda. So welcome to our workshop today on defending criminalized immigrant survivors. My name is Shirley Liu, she, her pronouns, and I am with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and we're a national resource and advocacy center on gender-based violence affecting Asian and Pacific Islander communities in the US. And I'm joined by Neda and Hyejin from Survived and Punished California, who will be your amazing facilitators today. I'm going to hand it over to them in just a second after I go over a little bit of housekeeping. So we will be recording this webinar today, or this meeting workshop today. And we'll be sharing the slides and the recording with you all afterwards. It will be up on our website. So just so you know, we will have breakout rooms, and that's the reason that we are on a meeting instead of a webinar. And because of the recording, if you don't feel comfortable, feel free to turn your camera off. However, if you do feel comfortable, we'd love to see you. We also have captioning today. I'm seeing that there's some audio issues. Let me know if there's anybody else can't hear me. But we do have live captioning today, so you can access that in your Zoom options. I think most people should be pretty familiar with Zoom by now, but it should be in your bottom toolbar. You may need to hit the little ... for the captioning options to show up. And I believe that's all the housekeeping that I have for you today. I'm just going to turn it over to our amazing facilitators in the interest of time here, Neda and Hyejin. Thank you both for coming.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. My name is Hyejin. I'm a member of Survived and Punished California and a co-founder of Survived and Punished National. I actually used to work at API-GBV, so I see some familiar faces and some of you might recognize me as well. I'm excited to be here, and hopefully we can dive deep into this conversation about how advocates and DV organizations can really support this really critical and under-supported group of survivors. Neda?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hyejin, and thank you, Shirley, for starting us off with the housekeeping to make sure folks can access everything they need. Hello, everyone. My name is Neda Saeed. I use they and she pronouns. I am also an organizer with Survived and Punished, and have previously done domestic violence work at an agency in San Francisco. And yeah, similar to Hyejin, just really excited to talk to you all about this. I've done this training with quite a few different groups, and this is one of my first times doing it with a group of folks who work within gender-based violence. So I'm really excited for the conversation we're going to have today. So to get us started, if we could go to the next slide, please. Some things that we're trying to do today. So these are objectives for this training. We want to work on understanding how gender violence contributes and leads to criminalization for marginalized communities, such as women of color, immigrant, and Asian communities. We're going to grow our awareness around criminalization of survival, so what that is and how survivors themselves become criminalized. And lastly, we're going to be exploring concrete ways to build relationships with and support incarcerated and criminalized survivors. That's what we're hoping to get to together. If we could go to the next slide for the agenda. That is how we're planning on getting there. So right now we're in the introduction. We're going to take time to unpack the perfect victim myth. We're not going to be doing a domestic violence 101 in this training because we all kind of know that. So we're going to start with unpacking the perfect victim. We'll then talk about the criminalization of survival, and then spend a bulk of our time talking about applying this learning. So we want to do not just this growing of awareness and understanding, but also exploring concrete ways that folks can apply this in their work. And then that'll take us to the closing. To guide our conversation today, we have some community agreements. If we could go to the next slide. And I see the chat about slowing down. Thank you so much for reminding me, and I will be sure to do that. So we hope that folks have familiarity with community agreements and have learned and used them before. We do want to highlight a few. So one is moving up and moving back, just being mindful of how much space you're taking up. Mindful disclosure. So please being mindful of what we share and the trauma of the stories. I think it's really important to be specific, and it's also really important to withhold graphic details where possible, because that can be really triggering for folks. Many of us doing this work are survivors ourselves, right? Lastly is self-care. Please do what you need to do. Take breaks. We're all working from home, or a lot of us are. We don't need unnecessary formalities. So we're just going to do away with that. So if you need to be drinking tea, if your pet makes a cameo, that's completely fine. And lastly, brave space. Just know that this is a space for us to try on new things and be prepared to learn. We're all coming in this space as experts, and we all have so much more to learn. Thank you. If we could go to the next slide. Oop, actually, we're going to stop sharing slides and link to the Padlet. I'm so sorry, Shirley. So we're going to talk about this myth of the perfect victim. I'm sure you all are familiar with the ways in which that survivors are expected to be perfect victims in order to be worthy and deserving of support. So they can't have tried to defend themselves or fight back. They can't have taken, done anything that would be considered illegal, or maybe they previously lied about what was happening or weren't fully honest about it. We have to expect folks to be perfectly, this idea of a perfect victim, right? And to have never been someone who has agency in their situation. And so I think it's really important to take time to unpack that. And actually, I'm realizing I have skipped ahead a little bit, so I'm going to pass it over to Hyejin.
Thanks, Neda. So we're just going to kind of open with a brainstorm together. Shirley has dropped a link in the chat for the Padlet, where you can go and answer the opening question, which is, how have you seen a survivor's arrest or criminalization affect their safety? We'd love to hear from you about, what you've seen, your experiences while doing the work. I know that in the years that I was doing domestic violence work for the Asian Women's Shelter in San Francisco, that it was something that I was really surprised by initially. So you can go to the link, and if you see the little plus sign on the bottom right in pink, that is how you can add responses. So as you can see, Shirley, there we go. So I am seeing responses start to come in. People are saying that they've seen a survivor's arrest and criminalization result in losing custody of children, experiencing increased surveillance, unfounded arrests and blame, survivor losing their job, endangering their immigration status, unable to access services and legal help, losing their spot in shelter, CPS involvement, a whole host of things. A DV survivor experiencing rearrest or increased monitoring, like ankle GPS monitors, after trying to get help from police or parole officers. And surely, I think if you scroll down a little, we can see more of the responses. But it's putting them in jail for possession of drugs, negative judgments from law enforcement, screened out of shelter due to criminal record, lack of trust for law enforcement assistance, and so on and so forth. It seems like many of us have seen what can happen when a survivor is arrested, either for something related to their situation of domestic violence, or the ways that they might be coping, right? And like Neda said, the perfect victim myth, I think, is so pervasive, not just in society where people have an idea of like what a perfect victim should look like or sound like or act like, but also what we internalize as systems and service providers and people in these helping roles. So, I think advocates kind of know firsthand that survivors' coping mechanisms and the ways that they are trying to navigate domestic violence can result in things that people from the outside might not understand or have a lot of judgment around. So, and limited housing options after incarceration, delegitimization of experiences. So, in so many ways, we see arrest and criminalization closing a lot of doors, and survivors that I've supported who have been incarcerated or put in immigration detention for, say, child abduction after trying to flee their abuser with their child, but not knowing that they needed to file a good cause report. Like survivors like that who come out and face like a total lack of resources, housing discrimination, job discrimination. And it really begs the question, when a survivor has their options narrowed like this, like what actually is there left for them to do in order to survive their abuse in a way that is legible or approvable by society? So Shirley, can we scroll back up a little bit? So a couple more. Perpetrators can exploit a survivor status, alerting parole officers, etc. Yeah, and I think too, we see a lot how there's almost this like myth that when there is a domestic violence situation, that the person who calls the police is the survivor, but often that's not the case, right? Sometimes it is a family member, sometimes it is a neighbor, sometimes it is actually the abuser themselves who's calling the police on the survivor in order to further incriminate them. And it can result in a whole host of different outcomes depending on who shows up and what they decide to do. So thank you so much for sharing some of your observations and what you've seen while doing the work. Neda, I will pass it to you.
Thanks, Hyejin, for letting us start to dive into things a little bit. So next, we're going to expand a little bit more on this myth of the perfect victim. Shortly, Shirley's going to drop in a link to a second Padlet. So as Hyejin mentioned, this myth of the perfect victim is so, I think, ingrained and pervasive in our society, as we've seen quite a bit in current events as well. That being said, that means it's also reflected in our systems and often the way that folks even do like the work to support survivors. It can really sneak up on us in different ways. So for the next Padlet, we're going to ask folks to answer two questions. The first is, how do systems expect survivors to be perfect victims? How does this myth and stereotype that we have in society then become reflected in our systems? And the second question has us go a little bit deeper. How do our own API-GBV and SA agencies sometimes judge clients according to their own standards of perfect victimhood? So the Padlet works the same way, but this one's structured a little bit differently because there's two questions. So you can click the plus sign anywhere below question 1, whether it's 1 or 1 continued, to add your thought for question number 1. We just have 2 columns because there's a big group. And then you can take time to answer for question number 2. And thank you so much, Shirley, for demonstrating how you can use any of the columns. Thanks, folks. We'll give it a minute or two for everyone to share their responses.
So I'm seeing some responses starting to trickle in. Folks are sharing that they see that systems expect survivors to get every detail right, expect them to do nothing wrong ever. Courts expect survivors to have zero contact with an abuser after violence occurs, even when they have children in common. Requirements in housing and other systems to have injunctions for protection about criminal record, no mental illness, custody of children. Systems expect survivors to report everything, but also expect them to stay silent. And they expect, while that's happening, they also expect them to disclose all the details immediately of what is happening. Denial of self-defense claims, expectations to remember everything that happened perfectly despite trauma affecting memory. And, this idea that, if you really did survive something, then you would remember everything in perfect detail, everything in perfect order, and everything correctly is so unrealistic because most of us in the day-to-day, like, I know that I can barely remember what I did yesterday, right? And that's not even with like the intense trauma and disorientation that domestic violence causes in someone's life. To report every time, to leave and not go back, to not fight back, to not self-medicate, to just be vessels taking the abuse. Systems expect survivors not to drop charges and cooperate 100% with law enforcement, even though survivors often have pressure to actually drop charges, maybe from their partner, maybe from their community. And yeah, so I think there is like a whole host of experiences, especially, with within like marginalized communities, immigrant and refugee communities that don't really line up with reality in so many ways. And as for how our own agencies might sometimes judge clients according to their own standards of perfect victimhood, folks are sharing that that sometimes organizations have unrealistic expectations about survivors to know exactly what abuse is, discharging people with histories of substance use, declining to serve anyone with a history of using violence. And this is so particular, right? The idea that victims never fight back, or that they never get violent themselves, or that they never do anything wrong. And if they did, then they deserved it, or like the myth of mutual abuse comes in. And I think it's so important for, in my experience, I've seen that's really important to have like a more nuanced understanding of violence, as violence not being the same thing as abuse, but abuse being a pattern and a cycle of using violence to control someone, right? But in many situations, a survivor might need to use violence in self-defense. There's a whole category of survival actions that survivors may use called reactive violence, right? So, sometimes a survivor might need to push someone back who's cornering them, or yell back to keep someone away, or even hit back because they're fed up, right? And they have a moment when they snap. And often this moment when they snap can be the moment when it all gets turned back on them, that they're the abusive one, or that they're causing it, that they're deserving it. And yeah, so thank you for sharing that one. Agencies sometimes judge emotional expressions of survivors, trying to gauge if they seem like they're lying. And I think this scarcity mentality of resources and who we serve can really get in the way sometimes of seeing survivors as they are in their situations, how much work they're putting back into themselves and quantifying it, judging when a survivor can't explain in a chronological timeline. We may question a survivor story if they're also experiencing mental health crises, buying into the model minority myth and not being messy. That is an interesting one. Thank you for sharing that. The survivor may appear crazy compared to the person who's causing them harm, who might seem put together, charismatic, etc. Second guessing what the survivor, quote unquote, should have done, and their story might be scrutinized more. So yeah, so thank you for sharing all of these examples of what you've seen. I think they are really critical, and I feel like it's so important to get these moments to reflect on, as we're doing this kind of work that is often on the margins, how sometimes we can replicate some of the same dynamics that are happening in mainstream spaces or even in our communities that are not always very survivor friendly. So yeah, so I think other things that might come up are labeling clients angry or uncooperative. They're not ready for the help that we want to give them, refusing or terminating services to drug users or to sex workers, not wanting to take clients with mental health issues or disabilities, using minor rule infractions that gauge obedience, such as a curfew, in order to terminate services, seeing traumatized behaviors as defiant, justifying controlling behaviors or practices with rules about safety. So all these like arbitrary things that I think sometimes agencies can implement to help them feel like they're in control of a situation or to like protect their capacity, etc., can come down actually in some pretty harsh and perhaps sometimes unintended ways for survivors that get in the way of really connecting with them and helping them when they need it most. So thank you all for sharing your observations and your experiences. I think it's really important to ground this conversation in what all of you are seeing in the field. So thank you, and I'll pass it back to Neda.
Thanks. Just to echo Hyejin, a lot of appreciation for the richness of these responses, and it makes me even more excited for us getting into the conversation later about concrete ways of supporting criminalized survivors. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about criminalization and how that impacts folks and makes it even more difficult to survive violence. So in just a moment, we'll share screen again back to the PowerPoint. Folks are familiar with the power and control wheel. This is a really great next iteration that demonstrates a power and control wheel, but we see intimate partner violence on the left and then state violence on the right. And it really illustrates how this same criminal legal system that is supposed to be protecting survivors or quote unquote like solving the issue of gender-based violence actually utilizes power and control to further abuse and traumatize survivors. So I'm not going to go through the entire section on the left, but I do want to take some time to talk about the section on the right that really goes into detail about how the criminal legal system utilizes violence to further abuse survivors. So emotional abuse is something that happens, making them feel bad about themselves, often blaming them for the harm that happens. Intimidation and stalking, so they might threaten folks with violence or threaten them with punitive measures while they're inside for not obeying arbitrary commands. Coercion and threats, they might threaten with greater violence or threaten to lose visits or programming or segregation. Economic abuse, so we know there's really exploitative prison labor, and also just how much people have to pay themselves to be incarcerated, so commissary costs, and also the cost to be in contact with loved ones. And just to clarify, when I say inside, I mean like folks who are incarcerated. But yeah, so there's quite a bit of just the cost of being incarcerated is really high, and that's something that can be used against survivors. Folks can also use their privilege. So staff working inside jails and prisons might enforce arbitrary rules and make people follow these arbitrary rules. There's also a constant surveillance, and it's a surveillance of the person themselves, but also who they interact with, what they do. And staff and prison guards can use that to further control survivors. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. So it might be folks staff and guards inside might deny the harm that they have caused. They might also, there's been experiences where survivors who are incarcerated will say like, I filed a grievance and nothing happened. And that's something that happens all too often. We talk about isolation, so controlling who's able to visit them, also doing things like putting them into solitary confinement. And additionally, when people who are incarcerated talk on the phone or receive mail, all of that is listened to or read by staff. So there is this constant surveillance and not really privacy. And then lastly, using children. So they might threaten to take visits away if they're getting programming related to like harm against their child that has happened in the situation of violence. They might hold that against them or blame them for what's happening or not being able to protect their child from harm. and then also threatening them with permanent separation from their children. So staff and prison guards can really hold a lot of power over people who are incarcerated, and really a lot of determinations in terms of what resources and privileges they can access. Privileges, right? The right to survive, but also hold a lot of power in terms of what happens for that person next, right? Like we just talked about children, but also like when will they be released and what the conditions will be. So we see here that this dynamic of power and control that's utilized by people who do harm in situations of domestic violence is also reused and replicated by the criminal legal system. And thank you, Hyejin, for adding some additional thoughts too. So as mentioned, these slides will be available to you, so you'll be able to revisit this if you would like. So again, these systems we have that are supposed to protect survivors often use the very same tactics of abuse and perpetuate violence. So this is why it's really important to start doing things differently. So how is it that we have decided that in our society, some people are deserving and deserve help and some people aren't? So we're going to review the definition of criminalization. If we could go to the next slide. All right. So if you just might have to press the space bar for the animation. So criminalization is the process by which behaviors and individuals are transformed into crime and criminals. So there's this like binary that happens, right? Where some people are considered good and bad. And then if we look at the perfect victim myth, some people are good victims and some people are bad victims. And then we see how that's replicated in different places in terms of systems and also our very own agencies. And so I think it's really important to take the time to think about how society determines like who's a quote unquote criminal, because so much of that can sneak into the ways that we're supporting survivors and determining who deserves help and who doesn't. I'm going to go into the next slide, please, and get into the criminalization of survival. We've used this phrase a lot, and we want to talk more about like how it is that happens. So there's a few common ways. The first is immigration enforcement. So for folks who are undocumented or have vulnerable immigration status, they might fear or try not to attract too much attention to themselves, especially towards something that could involve police. Even survivors with green cards can be at risk of deportation. And one of the primary ways that ICE works is to use arrest and criminal conviction to consolidate a pool of deportable immigrants. So folks are incarcerated, and then when they're released, they're then detained and face deportation. So there's this double criminalization that happens solely because of their immigration status. Next is defending themselves. So as we talked about before, folks might choose to defend themselves against violence to save their life, or because, as Hyejin said, like because they're fed up. So this can be framed as like mutual abuse, battery, or even murder. So the survivor could be arrested and charged with domestic violence because they're being perceived as overly emotional, violent, or unstable themselves, especially if they have fought back. And I think often because it is this snap moment or someone fighting back to save their life, things can really escalate. And then of course, like as Hyejin said, that's when things often blow back on the survivor, and then all of a sudden everything is their fault when they're just doing their best to survive the entire time. So yeah, defending oneself is definitely something that comes up. The next one is being coerced to do illegal acts or being charged by association. So someone might be an accomplice to crimes solely, or things that are perceived as crimes solely because they were coerced by their abusive partners into committing crimes. So that can range from theft to participating in the drug trade. Survivors can be also charged as accomplices to crimes that their abusive partners committed, even murder, if they were just a witness to the crime and didn't necessarily help plan or execute it. They can still be charged as an accomplice. And in fact, most survivors serving life without parole sentences in California are doing so because they were framed as accomplices for something that was done by the person who was harming them. So it's this really terrible, like just compounded violence and criminalization that folks experience. And then lastly is failure to protect. And folks might be familiar with this too when there are children involved. staying with children in an abusive situation where those children are then harmed by the person who's abusing them. And the survivor parent is also being coerced and threatened, but then they are criminalized for not protecting their child when really they're in an impossible situation. And it's really difficult for them to protect their children as they would like to. And the second piece that can be part of this is child abduction and kidnapping. So if they're fleeing with their children from an abusive situation. But yeah, again, as I said, it's an impossible situation. It's hard when one is being abused and their children is being abused. There's only so much survivors can intervene. And a survivor's attempts to protect a child are going to look different in every situation, especially because, folks' options are limited and they're really just doing the best that they can. So these are the 4 common ways we see survivors criminalized, and we're going to illustrate these more with some concrete examples of folks who have experienced this.
Next slide, please. Oh, thanks, Shirley. So these are some campaign images from survivor defense cases that Survived and Punished has supported with. The image on top in the center is of Nia Norn, who is a member of Survived and Punished and currently an organizer and executive director of the Asian Prisoner Support Committee. But Nia's history is that she is from a refugee family and saw a lot of violence growing up, experienced a lot of violence growing up. And she entered into a relationship with a man much older than her when she was, I think, in her late teens, who became extremely abusive and out of jealousy actually murdered Nia's employer and used that to threaten her to stay silent, that if she reported it, then he would kill her too. And she was subjected to, I think every kind of domestic violence that one can experience. And she finally went to the police to report the murder because she was growing more and more afraid for her life. And she really felt like she was in danger. And when she did go to the police to tell them what had happened and to ask for support, they actually arrested her and charged her with being an accomplice to the murder that her abuser conducted in order to threaten and isolate her, right? So Nia is someone who was in the California prison system for several decades, I believe. I think about 16 years. And she was pardoned by, or her sentence was commuted by Governor Brown. So she was able to be eligible for parole and be released. But as soon as she was released, ICE picked her up. And she was then taken to immigration detention, where she was fighting her immigration case to stay here because she would have been deported back to a country that she had not been to since she was a young child. And so even though she was a refugee with legal status, because she's not a citizen and because of her criminal record, she was still made into a deportable person. The person on the right is Noor Salman. Some of you might have heard her name before, but she is the ex-partner of the Orlando Pulse shooter Omar Mateen. And in the wake of the Pulse shooting, the government felt like they need to have someone to blame because Omar Mateen was also died with the shooting. And and she was tried in federal court for also kind of aiding and abetting what had happened or having been an accomplice to it when she had really no idea what was happening. And also she was a victim of the extreme domestic violence that Omar Mateen put her through. And I think those of us who are paying attention to the intersection of mass shootings and domestic violence have seen that over and over again, domestic violence tends to be a precursor to these mass shootings, right? A precursor, a trigger, a red flag that is not actually really taken seriously by society because domestic violence against women is so normalized. So she's an example of someone who is also criminalized as a result of something that she didn't even do. And there's Kai Peterson, who is a Black transgender man who is from Georgia, who was assaulted and raped by a stranger on his way home. and he fought back in self-defense, which resulted in the death of his rapist. And so when Kai Peterson was arrested for what had happened, he still had injuries from the assault. He was still really traumatized from what had happened, but he was not provided with medical care. When he did get a rape kit done, the nurse and medical staff told him that he didn't really look like a typical victim. And his own defense attorney told him that he should just take the plea deal or not really fight his case because he was already not going to be what people thought of as a real victim of sexual assault. So Kai Peterson eventually took a plea deal and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. So Kai is luckily out today, but what he went through just for defending himself is really unimaginable, right? You know, in such a vulnerable moment to be arrested, incarcerated, and it makes like one of the worst acts of violence that you've experienced into something that has so much more of an impact, because sometimes it's like the system takes up the work of abusing someone where they left off and continues it. And the last case I'll mention is that of Kelly Savage, who was incarcerated for, I believe, 20 some years. And she was arrested and imprisoned as a very young woman. And she was also like a lifelong survivor of family abuse, who then entered into an abusive partnership where her husband, she was experiencing very severe acts of physical violence from him, all kinds of violence. And she called a domestic violence shelter to try to get away, but because she was in a more rural area, she didn't have a way of getting there. So she talked to the shelter, made a safety plan, gathered her important documents, and was getting ready to escape with her child on a bus to get to the nearest shelter. But unfortunately, what happened was that her husband found the documents that she had been preparing, put it together that she was leaving, and while she was out running errands, he murdered her son. So, when she came back, of course, like, it's hard to put into words. But for what happened, she was not seen as a victim by the courts. Like, this was not seen as an act of violence that was also meant to control and abuse her, but instead she was actually tried as an accomplice to what had happened. And I think her charges were something like torture and murder of a child. It was like this very like really sensationalized charges, and no real consideration of what was happening in terms of the domestic violence. So Kelly is also someone who is as a member of Survived and Punished, and has been while she was locked up, and continues to organize with us since being freed a few years ago through a defense campaign, and asking Governor Brown to commute her sentence and let her go. But all these cases, I think, are, at the many intersections of, what happens with survivors who kind of fall through the cracks, or are in these very dangerous situations, or are experiencing these very, very severe forms of violence and have, very few options. But what happens is that everything gets compounded and put back on them. So these are a couple examples, and I'm sure that for many of you, you might have seen similar things in the survivors that you've supported, or stories like this in your local area. So I'm going to kind of open this up back for discussion with everybody, and ask if you or your organization have experience supporting criminalized survivors. And if yes, what has it been like? And if not, what do you think might cause this? So I'll put that in the chat. And Brittany asked in the chat, I am not well versed in legal terminology. Is there a difference between pardoned and commuted? Yeah, there is one, and there's different application processes for both. Pardoned is when you're fully exonerated and your record is basically expunged. So Nia is someone who is eventually pardoned, I believe. And commuted means that, if you have like a very long sentence, that you can apply for a commutation, which would reduce your sentence and make you eligible for parole, or if you're serving a life sentence, and you're not eligible for parole at all because you're expected to be in there forever until you die, then if your sentence is commuted, then your sentence can be reduced, and then you can actually apply for parole and eventually be released. So, so pardons and commutations have slightly different but similar processes. But back to the question, do you or your organization have experience supporting criminalized survivors? If yes, what has it been like? And if not, what do you think might be contributing to this? Feel free to share in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and share as well. From our previous brainstorms together, it does seem like a lot of you do have experience supporting criminalized survivors, whether that's ranging from people who've been arrested in relation to the DV or arrested as a result of substance use, so on and so forth. And your agency maybe sometimes does or doesn't respond accordingly. Folks are saying in the chat that yes, we have been successful with using VAWA exemptions for housing applications and prevention of evictions. That's awesome. Yes, and it's been very difficult because these survivors really need good legal support, which can be expensive, hard to find, or overall inaccessible. Yes, that's one of the biggest challenges, and it's so expensive. My organization does advocacy with local prisons and jails. They typically limit us to 3 meetings total with an advocate in prisons. And with a jail, our services are not explained well, and folks only see us as the quote-unquote support group. Yes, we have accompanied victims to court hearings and meetings who have been charged, or a no contact order is filed against them. We have also is that an NCO? We have also visited survivors in jail and have done support groups. It's been helpful to survivors to receive services when they thought they might not have gotten them because they were charged. We do get questions from other professionals because I think they are confused on why we as victim advocates are there. Yeah, I think there's this huge, huge area where people don't really see that intersection, but the statistics tell us that the majority, up to 94% of people in women's prisons have experienced some kind of domestic or sexual abuse before being incarcerated. And for girls in juvenile detention, the statistics are similarly high of young people who have experienced sexual abuse or some kind of abuse growing up. And according to the California Coalition of Women Prisoners, most, if not all, of people in women's prisons, in the California prisons who are serving life sentences, are serving life sentences that are directly tied to what they did to survive the abuse. Our agency's crisis number is available to people in our county jail. Even though we provide service without judgment, it can be really frustrating that our ability to support people and help them is so limited by the surveillance. Most of the time, we can facilitate confidential phone calls through advocacy. Yeah, and something that we do in California that has been helpful is to partner with some lawyers who will then tell the prison or jail that we are legal assistants, so we can have protected visits and more protected communications. It's never really a guarantee because they don't really have to do things the way that they're supposed to, but that's definitely been something that has been helpful for us in getting more visits and more time with folks. Yeah, people are giving a lot of examples of things that come up when supporting criminalized survivors. Facing more barriers when it comes to housing, legal systems, supporting clients and building a support system. Really hard to build survivors' cases when detained to gather evidence to fight deportation. And yeah, Lauren makes a really good point that it's hard not just because the criminalization disqualifies survivors from a lot of state-funded programs like housing, but it's also hard because survivors who are criminalized become frustrated with social services and stop seeking help. They feel that advocates and civil legal service providers are part of the same broader system that has failed them time and time again. Yeah, the disillusionment, the way that people can get jaded, and sometimes when you're meeting a survivor and they're meeting you, they might not be seeing you as the individual and your first experience, but to them, you can be the next person in a long series of people who have failed them or disappointed them. Advocates in my state report being searched and having to wait a very long time to visit with survivors in prison. And yeah, I think there's a lot of really rich examples in the chat. And recently, Ant shared that we get so many survivors that have had their kids taken from failure to protect that it's almost routine. Brittany shared that VOCA requirements, Victim of Crime Act requirements, also mean that we cannot report some of our services to criminalized survivors because the abuser is legally considered the victim. Yeah, this is all very, it's both like really heartening to see that so many folks are really fighting to support survivors inside, or survivors who have been criminalized. And it's also so depressing to see like all the challenges laid out like this, because it can really feel impossible. And it does kind of make it feel like by design that people inside are not supposed to be seen as complex human beings, are not supposed to be seen as actual victims of violence that have happened, violence that has happened. And yeah, but thank you all so much for what you've shared. I think it's really important to dive deep together. So we're going to go into small group breakouts, which Shirley is going to help us with. They are going to be a bit shorter because we are a little behind on time, but we're going to have maybe about 10 minutes to discuss a couple of small group breakout questions. So the first one, and we'll put this in the chat as well, the first one will be, how have you practiced safety planning with survivors who are at risk of fear or experience criminalization? And the second is, are there any practices that have helped you in supporting a survivor navigating the victim blaming or proxy abuse by the legal system? So thank you, Neda and Shirley. Shirley, do you mind putting everyone into small groups?
Yes, I will go ahead and do that. Give me just 1 second. Okay. So you should have something pop up inviting you to join a breakout room. For those of you who are streaming on Facebook, I'm sorry that there's no Facebook counterpart to breakout rooms, but you can feel free to discuss in the chat, and I'll continue posting your comments in the Zoom chat. Saw that somebody just joined. We are currently in breakout rooms, so if it should have automatically popped up the option for you to join a breakout room. If not, I can assign you. We're in small groups discussing whether or not you've practiced safety planning with survivors who are at risk of, fear, or experience criminalization. And are there any practices that have helped you in supporting a survivor navigating the victim blaming or proxy abuse by the legal system? So let me know if you have any questions. I'm sorry that the timing didn't work out, joining in the middle of a breakout room.
Welcome back, folks. We'll give just a moment for everyone to come back from their breakout rooms and then get started. All right, I think this is just about everyone. I hope you had a good time in your groups. Based on the richness that we've seen from this group so far, I'm sure you had some really great conversations. And it was really important to us to make time to report back. So I invite folks, if you'd like, to either share a report back of just some highlights from your conversation, either in the chat, or you can type stack into the chat, and then I'll call on you to come off mute and share verbally if you'd like. So two options: you can type in the chat as a report back, or type stack and we'll call on you to share verbally. And just to clarify, we'll start with the first question, since these are two content heavy questions, but we'll start with: how have you practiced safety planning with survivors who are at risk of, fear, or experience criminalization? Thanks, Keith, for starting us off. Our group primarily talked about services each of our organizations offer and how they have helped in both questions. That sounds great. Is there any particular services or structure of services that you all talked about providing that helped overcome some of these barriers?
Yes, so something that I found very consistent with all our answers was being able to give information that survivors may not have. So being able to navigate family law, being aware of what a U visa or T visa is, getting resources for representation, or even just learning more about the criminal justice system. And what I had mentioned was that regardless of how direct our services might be, or even indirect, I think just being there for survivors, being validating, and also teaching them about how to navigate the legal system and what they need is always going to be really helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you. I've definitely heard, criminalized and formerly incarcerated survivors talk about how even during sentencing, they didn't know what was happening, right? And folks just needed clarity and information, as well as, information on all the potential options that might be possible for them. So I appreciate you all sharing that. And then what you said about just being affirming and validating, right? Like survivors are being gaslit and invalidated through every contact and point of contact with the criminal legal system. So I think it's really important to just be that person for folks where possible. Dr. Nusrat, I see your hand up. Would you like to share?
Thank you. So in our group, we had, advocates from several areas like Florida and Wisconsin, and I'm from Texas, and so on and so forth. All of us actually had a common thread in our conversation, is that what they're seeing on ground is they're using immigration as a tool. So a lot of the abuses actually, surrounds immigration, and that, and we have. And in my experience, I've seen how incarceration happened because to avoid, a citizenship to be questioned. And the survivor, and there's culture. The other thing that we spoke about was culture. So for cultural reasons, a lot of our survivors don't actually come forward, and then the abusers use that. And they, in a mutual combat, domestic violence often, ends up in a mutual combat. And so, they are the ones who are calling police and then have them arrested. So a lot of us spoke about the safety planning, and know your rights to survivors if they come to us prior to being arrested and all. So if they come to us, we do have do the safety planning and and all, so that they have they can make an informed choice.
Absolutely. I think informed choice is so important when choice and agency is so often taken away in situations of violence. And I appreciate what you shared too around know your rights, people having more information about what's available, even though sometimes the criminal legal system violates people's rights as well. And then what you said about how many barriers there are for folks coming forward. And we know that abuse thrives in isolation and in secrecy. So I think it just really helps compound existing conditions. I'm going to turn to the chat now. I'm seeing from Sabina, working as a sexual assault victim advocate in Texas, having confidentiality with survivors, letting people know during medical accompaniments and forensic that they can speak privately if there's things that they don't want to go on medical record that might be shared with law enforcement. And being very clear that they aren't law enforcement and don't work for them. And there's no obligation to report to law enforcement if they don't want to. Yes, I think making that differentiation sounds really, really important, especially when so often, as we all know, support services can be very entrenched with law enforcement or have to work in this kind of forced partnership when often advocates know that's not what is most helpful. So I really appreciate that you all make that differentiation. Any other folks want to share a bit about their conversation in regards to safety planning and how you've safety planned with survivors who are at risk of or fear criminalization? All right, we can move to the second question, which I'll put in the chat, but we'd love to hear from you all, if any, what practices you talked about that have helped you in supporting a survivor navigating victim blaming or proxy abuse from the legal system. And yes, Hyejin, thank you so much for calling out this toolkit. Do you want to take a minute to just explain this toolkit and what it is and why it might be relevant for folks before we move away from safety planning conversation?
Yeah, sure, Neda. It's a resource that we recently released for people who are trying to figure out safety planning when someone may or may not want to call the police, and it's for everyday people, advocates, prison abolitionists, activists, whoever needs this resource, basically. But it includes some information that maybe you all already know, but maybe some people in your networks or your communities might find useful about navigating the legal system, some of the unintended or unexpected things that can occur when navigating the legal system, such as getting a restraining order or calling the police, immigration, etc. So if you would like to, please check it out and feel free to share it with folks who might find it useful as well.
Thanks so much, Hyejin, for doing that on the fly. This is an incredible resource. So yes, please do share it. Maria, I'm seeing in the chat, I'm not sure what a LEO is. Would you mind telling us what the acronym stands for?
Law enforcement officer.
Thank you. Thank you. Advocating for survivors with law enforcement officers, as well as training law enforcement officers. Thank you. Again, I'm going to put this second question in the chat again, but would love to hear from folks, highlights from the conversation in your groups around practices that have helped you in supporting a survivor who's navigating victim blaming or proxy abuse from the criminal legal system. We have a few more minutes, so I'd love to hear from other groups.
There's a sound in my background, so if you have trouble hearing me, let me know. I work in supervised visitation for families that are court ordered because of domestic violence. And, ultimately, the supervised visitation program that I've worked at was created for with survivors in mind, so that children could spend time with the parent who used violence in a safe way. But because of the rise of survivor parents who are non-custodial parents, because of going through the court system and being deemed, unfit or feeling to protect and becoming involved in child welfare in some way, the supervised visitation program has kind of seen like this shift that we're now serving the people who we were originally like trying to protect. And so how do we shift our policies and our practices to recognize like supervised visitation is a mechanism of surveillance and we are related to the courts. And so how can we limit, you know, like the types of notes that we give to the courts, the reach of the court, and at the same time recognize our power and advocate on survivors' behalf, like by going to court and testifying if we need to, or, you know, like really leveraging our position.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I feel like you really spoke to some of the complexities and nuances that advocates have to face in this work, in terms of, as I said, like earlier, being entrenched with the system in many ways. And then also it sounds like you really think, thought about, well, like, how do we not replicate the harms that the system is doing in the ways that, for example, you named surveillance. And so I think it's so important to be iterative, right? Like we're trying things and it's okay to go back and shift it and be like, actually, this wasn't the best way and we can make some changes, right? So I really appreciate just that insight in terms of recognizing that, yeah, like some things maybe needed to be a little bit different, even while like doing your best within the system. And yeah, Sabina, like you said in the chat, really powerful and difficult work. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm gonna go back to one of the comments in the chat. Alexis shared having realistic conversations with survivors about what to expect from certain systems and people that they'll come in contact with and advocating for them with these same individuals. Yes, I think giving people an idea of what to expect can be so helpful, especially given that we talked about earlier, so many folks just have no information and are not given any information. So it's really important to be an advocate in that way. Yes. Affirmation and just appreciation for Sheila in the chat around what you shared. And I'm going to read, Hyejin, what you said. Family court and supervised visits is a critical place for intervention. So thanks for naming that. I'm also seeing someone mention, we talked about how ultimately abolition and community-based solutions are necessary for supporting survivors because our current system is not it. But in the meantime, we definitely still need Band-Aid solutions and legal support. As well. Yes, I think it's important to think about the long term and the short term. And it sounds like you all are really doing that in necessary ways in order to support and advocate for survivors. So that's really important. Thank you. We have just a few minutes left. I'd love to hear from one or two more folks before we go to the next section. Thank you, Brittany. I'm going to read this off from the chat. Our legal advocates, injunction attorneys, and high lethality, IPV program INVEST helps stick with the survivor through the court systems for civil and criminal justice. The child welfare program helps coordinate with survivors, navigating child protective services, and how they're attempting to absorb violence and deflect it away from children. Making sure that survivors make their appointments, providing items such as court clothing or diapers to show that the survivor has support in place to play by the system's rules. Yes, that's really crucial. And it reminds me of the comment earlier, right? Like we know that the system is not serving survivors the way that it should, and that these rules can be really unhelpful. And as part of that short-term Band-Aid support, it is important to support and advocate for folks so that they can play it by the rules as much as possible in order to achieve better outcomes for themselves. So thank you so much, folks, for sharing. Hyejin, is there any reflections you want to add before we transition to our next section? Cool. All right. Thank you. Or sorry, you unmuted. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I am muted because I think, am I next?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Shirley, if you could share the screen again for the slides. I'm just gonna go over some things that could be helpful in terms of supporting criminalized survivors. And it sounds like many of you have strategies and tactics and tools of your own, so please feel free to share in the chat. The first bucket of potential, things that can be helpful is going to be in this category of prevention. And so, you know, there's like always a period of time where a survivor or might be worrying about, you know, getting arrested or potentially getting in trouble with the legal system. So I think in terms of prevention, what can be helpful are evaluating organizational practices and internal education about the, you know, about the way that criminalization happens and what the impacts are. And I think just like getting more on the same page organizationally about how we understand criminalization, because I do remember instances in which I met other providers who were really unclear about, you know, if this person had a criminal record, how could they also be a victim or a survivor of violence? So, you know, getting people kind of up to speed or acquainted with all of this, developing strategies for safety planning that are able to anticipate specific risks of criminalization for the population that you serve. More open conversations and advocacy, challenging the practices of law enforcement and court, and growing the networks of support that can be activated when needed. And by networks of support, I mean, you know, people who can help write letters, people who can help show up to pack the court, people who can, you know, help spread the word if it is like a more public case or a case in which more community input and intervention could be helpful. In terms of intervention, there is, you know, learning and growing advocacy strategies that work in your locality, like packing the court, helping survivors organize their families or other service providers into helpful roles, defense campaigns, finding competent legal aid, help covering financial costs, emotional and practical support. And by defense campaigns, those are, I think, pretty labor intensive and I think very difficult to execute at times. But sometimes when a case is really public, then, you know, there might be room for there to be more pushback in changing the media narrative, pushing back on the narrative put forth by the district attorney, and really advocating for someone's release or for someone to not be deported. And I'm going to go to the chat, and Sabina says, we've had lots of conversations about protective ways to talk with survivors about accessing abortion care, another way that survivors may be criminalized in Texas. Thanks so much, Sabina. I actually, yeah, that is something that I actually did want to talk about, because I think increasingly it is going to become more and more difficult to separate the category of survivor from the category of quote unquote criminal, as we're seeing developments like the fall of Roe v. Wade and the ways that like even Facebook or social media or like period tracker apps, like how all of these can be kind of incorporated into cracking down on things like abortion, which is, in other words, a crackdown on survivors, right? Because the reproductive coercion is such a huge part of domestic violence. And also the fact that child marriage is legal in many, many places in the United States. So yeah, so thank you so much for bringing that up, Sabina. I think we are in pretty frightening times right now. And we're seeing in real time just how much, you know, how much things can be turned back in an instant. And it has been really frightening to witness not just the fall of Roe v. Wade, but the increasing, you know, attacks, I guess, on trans people, trans young people, and LGBTQ people as a whole. So thank you. Yeah, Mie said it is really scary. Surveillance capitalism, totally. Shirley, could you go to the next slide? And there's some post-sentencing support that you can also provide too that I think Neda was gonna go into.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And again, just really appreciating everything that's being named in the chat and you all participating in that way. So appreciate you. So yes, Hyejin reviewed some really great ways to intervene in terms of prevention and intervention. And we want to talk about post-sentencing too. So this is often a time where it's maybe, I don't want to say easiest, but I guess that's the word I'll use, easiest to come into contact with criminalized survivors because they're incarcerated, right? And so it's easier to be able to identify them. So it was important for us to have those other sections, and we're going to focus on post-sentencing as well. So first, I just want to say it is important to invest the time and resources to build relationships with organizations that support incarcerated people, especially if your organization doesn't already, because many incarcerated people are going to be survivors. And I think the statistic that's often quoted is 94% of women who are incarcerated are survivors of domestic violence. And we know that the number is probably much higher, and also that survivors are not just cis women. So it's really important in that way to support folks. So first on this slide too, you'll see that we have letter writing, which has often been cited from folks that were formerly incarcerated that we now organize with or have supported. Always name letter writing as like a lifeline through prison walls. So I encourage you all to connect with survivors in that way, or maybe that's something that the volunteer program can also do, is be connecting with survivors through letter writing. We do have a resource on letter writing on our website that I just put in the chat that can be helpful. In terms of actually working with incarcerated survivors, one helpful way can be to support peer groups inside. So often your local jails might have less programming and support. And so it can be important to explore, like, is partnering with your local jail an option? Or is there an organization that supports those who have been recently released that you can collaborate with? In terms of prisons, you can look up the program or community manager at the prison closest to you and see if there's support that you can provide. Usually that's the like prison staff person that coordinates those types of external partnerships. Many prisons have amazing domestic violence peer groups and folks who get trained up to do peer counseling. Hyejin earlier mentioned the case of Kelly Savage. Kelly Savage is a brilliant organizer, and also helped run the domestic violence peer group while she was incarcerated, and training other folks to do peer counseling. So this is often something that is possible, but it will require the support of a domestic violence organization to do that initial training and to connect with the prison. So that can be an important way to connect with folks. The other thing I want to name is offering support to those in local detention facilities. Often, especially I think, depending on where you are, there could be a detention center, or ICE will, for lack of a better word, rent out beds at local jails. And so they're really not set up for long-term incarceration. And often people are there for a very long time. So there's not a lot of services in place or infrastructure in place for people to have safe or livable conditions. So it can be really important to offer support in that way. And then lastly, being vocal in the fight to stop ICE transfers. So as we've talked about, folks or survivors might be criminalized and incarcerated for either doing their best to survive or some of the other ways that folks are criminalized. And then if they are undocumented or have vulnerable immigration status, they might serve their long sentence and finally be released. And then they are literally, upon release, picked up by ICE and taken to a detention center to await deportation. So it's really important to be vocal in that advocacy as well, because that kind of double criminalization really exponentially increases the violence that survivors experience. So these are some of the ideas that we wanted to share with you. I also want to name, we're really inspired by all of the things that you all are already doing. It's really amazing. I've done this training before where folks are like, oh yeah, we haven't thought about that, or that's not possible because they work directly with the police all the time. And those are the responses, quite frankly, that I'm used to hearing. And so it's really exciting for me to hear just all the amazing work that you all are doing and really being creative and committed to supporting survivors. So thank you for that. This is bringing us to a close. We have a few minutes to take some questions if folks have Q&A, and then also Hyejin, I see you came off mute.
Yes, one thing I wanted to add about Kelly Savage running the DV support groups in the California women's prison that she was in is that she had for years tried to get domestic violence organizations in the area to come in and do like 40-hour training, or even just like a one-off DV training for folks. And she just had a really hard time like finding anyone who would come do it. So I think she scrounged together like a bunch of outdated materials somehow. And that's how she kind of started doing like the peer support groups. And it was really a lot of like trying to teach herself to like teach others. And, you know, she said that for so many people inside, you know, there was still that stigma around domestic violence, and people didn't really want to talk about the ways that DV had been a part of their experience that led to them, you know, being locked up. And she has, you know, told me about the ways that, you know, even just talking about it, much like, you know, the world outside of prisons, the more you kind of talk about these things, the more that people turn to you for support. And this was very much Kelly's experience. And I think she's emphasized just, you know, how much DV organizations can really do to reach out to people and to provide that support, because a lot of people, especially like like people serving long-term sentences, feel very abandoned and feel very forgotten by the outside world. So, you know, in some ways, like providing that kind of support group or education or just like human connection helps people feel like they're not just completely invisible or like completely discarded by society. So thanks, Neda.
Totally. Thank you so much for that context, Hyejin. We have time for 1 or 2 questions before we close out. So we'll take just a minute for Q&A. If anyone wants to put their question in the chat or come off mute, we welcome it. Awesome. Thanks, folks. If a question comes to mind, drop it in the chat and we'll try to get to it, but we'll start to close out. So as I said, there's just, as I've said a few times during this training, I've been really excited about everything everyone has shared. But I'm going to stop real quick because I see, Sarah, you have a question. Please let us know your question.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you. So thank y'all so much for the information in this webinar. Do y'all ever do any work around human trafficking and criminalization? Because we know that that's huge. Like so many survivors of human trafficking get arrested for prostitution or crimes that their trafficker made them commit. And I mean, I think everything that you said can apply to trafficking victims, but I'm just wondering if you do work specifically in that area.
I think we haven't developed more work specifically around human trafficking, even though we have supported people in California prisons and jails who are locked up in relation to the trafficking that they experienced. But I feel like there are groups. One group I can think of off the top of my head is Red Canary Song, which is based in New York City. You already maybe know about them, but they organize massage workers who may or may not be trading sex in order to gain more resources, or who might also be experiencing trafficking themselves. So I feel like actually a really critical point for like having a more like survivor-centered and anti-criminalization lens on trafficking is sex worker rights organizations. Because actually so many sex workers are people who have survived trafficking either as young people or at some point prior in their lives. And I feel like people tend to separate like the image of like a sex worker or like a hand escort or whatever from like a victim of human trafficking. But those categories have, I think, a lot more overlap than we necessarily are comfortable talking about, because I know that sometimes trafficking organizations can be very religious or only like kind of like with the perfect victim narrative that we've been talking about, see victims of trafficking or survivors of trafficking as people who could never have voluntarily participated in any form of the sex trade. But what makes a lot of folks vulnerable to trafficking is their participation in the sex trade, right? And the way that closes out like opportunities or furthers stigma, etc. So I know that that just doesn't totally answer your question, Sarah, but I really appreciate that you asked it, because I feel like it's yeah, I don't know, all of it just feels and is so connected, right? The abortion criminalization, like sex worker criminalization, increasing law enforcement responses to everything. So yeah, thank you. I appreciate it a lot.
Yes, thank you both. We're going to head and go to the next slide, Shirley, if you wouldn't mind. And just as our closing, if you could tell us in the chat one thing you'll take with you from this workshop, and Hyejin and I will just share very quickly, because we're at time, some closing words. The last thing I want to say is, again, just really inspired by the work that you all are doing, and with so much appreciation at the extra effort, lengths, and creativity folks are going to support criminalized survivors. I think supporting criminalized and incarcerated survivors is a really important part of working towards a different model of safety. Hyejin, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I'm so appreciative of everything that folks shared today, and I feel really blown away by the powerful work that all of you are doing, and just so much appreciation because these times are wild and it's hard to stay in the work. But I also want to say that, you know, as part of Survived and Punished and in my other role at Community Justice Exchange, I am hoping to organize or gather with DV and sexual assault providers who are, you know, doing any kind of work with criminalized survivors. So I'd love to get in touch with you if possible, if you're up for it, for further conversations or focus groups, or even just like a more like maybe a smaller space to kind of get in deeper into these topics and how we can all support each other. So if you're open to that, please put your email in the chat, and I might ask Shirley to also help me outreach in the future too. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone, for having us. It was really a privilege to connect with you. Have a good rest of the day.
Shirley, if we can leave the chat open for just a couple more minutes while people.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
And if you need to get in touch or anything like that afterwards, I'll drop my email in the chat for that. And I just want to echo what everybody is saying. Thank you so much to both presenters, Hyejin and Neda, and then also everybody for being here today. And on Facebook, we have a couple folks watching on the Facebook live stream who were able to get in under the attendee cap today. I'll send out an email with all the resources and the slides and the recording to everybody here today. And yeah, just so much appreciation. There's just tons to unpack and kind of reflect on that you all shared today. Looks like people are still dropping their emails, so I'll go ahead and leave it open. But for those of you who have a next meeting to go to, feel free to just drop out. Those of you on Facebook who are don't want to leave your email in the public Facebook, feel free to send it in a message to us, like a direct message, or I'm sure you can find my email easily, or send it to our info email, info@API-GBV.org. Thank you so much, everybody. And I think that's it. I'm going to go ahead and close out. Have a good rest of your day. And thank you to our captioner today.